Title: A Quiet Unraveling. Setting: modern-day suburban Maryland, a mid-sized town not far from D.C., where professional couples juggle ambition and appearances. The story unfolds between a two-story home in a quiet cul-de-sac, a downtown law firm, and a local cafe that sees more secrets exchanged than coffee poured. Chapter 1. The house on Ashgrove Lane was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the settling wood. It was the kind of silence that didn't just fill space, it accused. Emily Carter sat at the kitchen island, her laptop open but untouched. Her eyes fixated on the phone lying face down beside her. A text she shouldn't have seen buzzed inside. Her mind like static. Last night was incredible. I still smell you on me. M. The message had come in while she was syncing photos from her husband's iCloud, an innocent task that turned into a grenade. Her husband, Daniel, was upstairs getting ready for work. 37, a partner at a law firm downtown, Daniel had the calm confidence of a man used to being listened to. But lately his eyes avoided hers too easily. His work trips had grown more frequent, his silences more loaded. Emily's hands clenched. After 12 years of marriage, 1 miscarriage, 1 daughter, and countless dinners discussing whether or not they could afford a second car, it had come down to this: a scent lingering on someone else. Chapter 2. Daniel adjusted his tie in the bedroom mirror. He noticed how his reflection avoided looking into his own eyes. Guilt had a weight, but it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't sharp or loud. It was dull, lingering. He'd met Maya at a deposition. She was a junior associate at another firm, sharp-tongued, unflinching, and entirely unlike Emily. 1 drink after a late trial turned into 2, and then weeks of excuses, extra briefs to file, late-night strategy calls. He didn't plan for it. It just happened. That was the line he'd rehearsed 100 times in his head, but not once aloud. As he came down the stairs, Emily looked up. Their eyes locked for a second. There was something different in hers today, stillness, like water just before a storm. Big day? She asked. Just a routine client review, he lied. He didn't ask her how her day looked. He hadn't for a while. Chapter 3. Emily didn't confront him right away. Instead, she followed the advice she'd once given her best friend Mira during her own divorce. Know more than you say. Say less than you know. So she waited. She copied the number from the message and hired a private investigator. The man, Colin Reyes, had a pasty, forgettable look and a surprisingly gentle voice. Within a week, he handed Emily a USB with photos of Daniel and Maya entering the Fairmont on Massachusetts Avenue. You want to keep digging? He asked, genuinely unsure. Emily hesitated. Just tell me if she's married. Chapter 4. Maya wasn't. 29, ambitious, and according to Colin, completely unaware that Daniel had a daughter or a mortgage. Emily felt sick. The betrayal wasn't just about sex. It was about erasure. Daniel had built a whole second, self, and never once flinched. Her anger cooled into something sharper. Clarity. She didn't want to scream or cry. She wanted to decide. That weekend, while Daniel was away on business, Emily met Mira at their favorite cafe downtown. She told her everything. Mira didn't gasp or dramatize. She leaned forward and said, "So what now?" "I don't know," Emily whispered. "I want him to hurt, but I also want him to explain." Chapter 5. Daniel knew. He felt it the moment he returned. The kitchen was spotless. Emily's tone was measured, polite. Their daughter, Sophie, 7 and all curiosity, ran up and hugged him, grounding him in a moment he didn't deserve. That night, Emily left her phone unlocked. On purpose. A photo of him and Maya was in the gallery. Daniel didn't sleep. Next morning, before she could leave for her art class, he stopped her at the door. "Can we talk?" She didn't move. "About what?" "You know what." Emily turned, jaw tight. "Do you?" Chapter 6. The argument lasted 3 hours. Quiet. Words at first, then louder. Accusations tangled with half apologies. Emily demanded to know how long it had gone on. Daniel lied. Once. She caught it. "You didn't forget. You chose this." He tried to explain. That they'd grown distant. That he felt like he was disappearing at home. That Maya listened. Emily's voice was low. "You wanted to feel young. Again. Important. I get it. But you chose a stranger over your daughter. Over me." They sat in silence after that, neither wanting to say the one thing they both thought. Maybe we're done. Chapter 7. Weeks passed. Daniel moved into a rented apartment. Sophie stayed with Emily, though he saw her twice a week. He didn't see Maya anymore. Whatever spark had existed between them fizzled the moment reality came crashing in. Colin sent Emily another message. Maya had filed a harassment complaint at her firm. Daniel's name was never officially mentioned, but rumors swirled. Emily visited her therapist for the first time in years. She talked about guilt, not hers, but the guilt she wished she felt, about how she didn't cry at night, about how part of her felt relieved. Meanwhile, Daniel tried therapy too. He confessed to a colleague, Marcus, the firm's senior partner, who surprisingly didn't judge. "You're not the first idiot I've known," Marcus said. "Just don't be the one who never learns." Chapter 8. One Sunday, Daniel came by for Sophie. Emily watched them from the porch, her daughter skipping into the car. Before Daniel could get in, she spoke. "I haven't told Sophie." "I know." "I won't. Yet." There was silence. Then, "Would you ever consider—" Daniel trailed off. Emily smiled, sad and knowing. "Reconciliation?" He nodded, eyes clouded. "I don't know," she said. "It depends on who you become, and who I become without you." He didn't argue. Epilogue. Months later, Emily opened a gallery showing some of her work. Her art had taken on darker hues, sharper edges, but people noticed. Mira stood beside her, proud. Daniel attended, alone, quiet. He didn't approach until the end. Emily didn't invite him in, but she didn't ask him to leave either. Their eyes met. No apologies, no promises, just a pause in the quiet unraveling. Final. Note, the future isn't tied in a bow. Emily hasn't forgiven, but she hasn't closed the door. Daniel carries his guilt like a shadow. Sophie, still young, senses the change but doesn't yet understand the storm. The betrayal fractured them, but whether it broke them completely is a question left to time. And perhaps that's the most honest ending of all. Autumn came with a crispness that crept under doors and reminded people of what they'd left unsaid. The leaves on Ashgrove Lane had turned amber and rust, blanketing the sidewalks like memory. Emily walked Sophie to the bus stop, holding her hand as the girl recited facts about foxes and owls and how leaves die but look pretty doing it. Daniel had been more consistent. He never missed a pickup. He never pushed for answers. He seemed smaller, somehow. Not in stature, but in presence. Like a man trying not to take up too much space in a world he once believed he owned. At the gallery, Emily's work had gained quiet recognition. A New York buyer had expressed interest. One piece in particular, the Divide, a black and crimson abstract featuring two jagged shapes almost touching, seemed to speak to people. Even those who didn't know her story. She still hadn't told Sophie, but the questions were coming. Why doesn't Daddy live with us anymore? Will you and Daddy ever be best friends again? Emily would answer gently, vaguely. Grown-up stuff. complicated stuff. But Sophie was sharp. She was her mother's daughter. Chapter 10. The cafe, again Emily met Mira at the same table where they had first discussed betrayal, revenge, and the 1,000 cuts that came before a marriage. Finally bled out. "Do you love him still?" Mira asked, not unkindly. Emily sipped her coffee. "Some days I think I might. Other days I hope I don't." "And what about him?" "He's trying. Therapy. He writes these letters, never gives them to me, but he tells me they exist." Mira raised an eyebrow. "Letters he won't show you? That's either romantic or cowardly?" "Maybe both," Emily said. "That's the problem. It's not one thing or another. He's not a monster, just a man who stopped choosing me until it was too late." Chapter 11, Daniel's apartment. Daniel sat at his desk reading the last letter he'd written. They were stacked in a drawer, each one dated, each one raw. He never sent them, not because he didn't want to, but because they were for him, not her. A record of the man he had been, and the one he was trying to become. Marcus had pulled him aside at work the other day. "You've changed," he'd said. "You're quieter. You listen more." Daniel hadn't known whether to be flattered or ashamed. He thought about Emily every day. Not just as a wife he'd betrayed, but as a person he hadn't really seen for years. The woman who painted emotions she couldn't always name, who stayed awake nights watching documentaries about polar explorers, who always smelled like eucalyptus and coffee. He had broken something he couldn't fix, but maybe he could at least honor it. Chapter 12, An Unexpected Invitation. The text came on a Wednesday night. "Would you like to have dinner? Just us. Not a talk, not a scene, just a meal." Daniel stared at it for a full minute before replying, "Yes, I'd like that." They met at a quiet Italian place they used to frequent before Sophie was born. The same place Daniel had once told Emily he wanted to name their daughter after his grandmother. Dinner was awkward at first, then surprisingly warm. They talked about work, about Sophie, about the weather, and finally, about nothing. Like old friends who had finally stopped trying so hard. No dramatic declarations. No fiery rekindling. Just two people carefully placing bricks back on a bridge neither of them was sure they wanted to finish. Chapter 13. The morning after, Emily stood in the backyard watching Sophie chase a squirrel with reckless joy. Daniel's coat still hung on a chair from the night before. He hadn't stayed. She wouldn't have asked him to. She thought about the things they hadn't said, that she missed him, that she still didn't trust him, that she didn't know if either of those things mattered anymore. Mira had once told her, "Love isn't about what you're willing to forgive. It's about what you're willing to live with." Emily was still deciding. She turned to go inside, the wind catching the edge of her coat like a whisper. From the street, Daniel watched for a moment longer before driving away. Final scene in her studio, Emily began a new painting, two figures, both cracked, both standing, not reaching for each other, just existing, side by side, broken, real, still, present. As her brush moved across the canvas, she realized something. Forgiveness wasn't a clean slate. It was a scar you learn to live with, and sometimes scars can be beautiful in their own way. The end. Or maybe just a pause. Weeks passed without labels or definitions. Emily and Daniel slipped into something uncertain, like a ceasefire, not peace. They spoke more, had coffee some mornings, walked Sophie to the bus stop together, but there were no sleepovers, no declarations. No talk of getting back together. It wasn't avoidance. It was caution. Every word now felt like a stone in a delicate balance. Emily spent more time painting. The gallery asked her to curate a solo show. Mira, with her blend of sarcasm and subtle pride, offered to help plan it. Daniel, meanwhile, had started volunteering at a local outreach program, tutoring underprivileged kids in math. He didn't tell Emily about it, just something that had started one evening and somehow continued. It grounded him in a way therapy hadn't. The therapist had once asked him, "Do you believe you deserve her forgiveness?" He'd answered, "I don't know. I'm not sure I deserve the question." Chapter 15. The envelope had arrived unannounced, a small brown envelope addressed to Emily in clean handwriting. Inside, a photograph, Daniel and Claire. A different angle. Not from the hotel. From months before, outside a bookshop near the university where Claire taught. His hand on her back. Familiar, easy. A smile that wasn't meant for a friend. No return address. No note. Emily stood frozen in the studio, the photograph fluttering in her hand like a threat. Someone had been watching. Someone knew more. Chapter 16. The investigator she called Mira. "I thought you didn't want to dig anymore," Mira said cautiously. "I didn't," Emily replied, "but someone already did. And now they're leaving breadcrumbs." Mira knew a guy. Of course she did. Jake Dorian, ex-cop, now a private investigator with a thick file of gray area ethics and a reputation for discretion. He met Emily at a quiet cafe 2 towns over. She handed him the photo. "I need to know if this was just one affair, or something else." Jake studied her face. "You think there's more?" "I think I stopped asking the right questions a long time ago." Chapter 17. Daniel's confession. Jake's report came back 2 weeks later. It wasn't a long affair. It was 2. Claire was the second. The first had happened 3 years prior during a work trip to Chicago. A woman named Jenna, a consultant from their parent company. One night. Never repeated. Emily sat across from Daniel in the park, the report in her hands. "I'm not angry," she said quietly. "I'm just tired of being the only one who told the truth." Daniel's face crumpled like someone had finally dropped the act. "I wanted to be better. For you. For Sophie. I told myself the Claire thing was an exception. A mistake. But it wasn't. It was a symptom. Of me. Of who I became." "You became a liar," she said, her voice cold but not cruel. He nodded. "I'm sorry, Em. No." They sat in silence for a long time, the wind carrying the rustle of dying leaves across the playground. Chapter 18. Choices. Emily stood outside her gallery the night of her solo show. It was a quiet success. Critics spoke softly, reverently, as they passed the divide, fault lines, inheritance, pieces soaked in emotional sediment, grief disguised as texture. Daniel had come. So had Sophie, beaming in her tiny red dress. But afterward, he waited outside, not beside her, not demanding space he hadn't earned. "You did this," he said, "all of it, without me." "Yes," she replied. "And maybe that's the point." Epilogue. 2 homes. Sophie drew 2 houses side by side. In one, Mommy painted and read books. In the other, Daddy made pancakes and told funny stories. Sometimes they all went for walks together. Sometimes they didn't. She didn't know the word for what they were now, but it didn't feel broken. Last line, Semele kept the photo in her drawer. Not as a wound, but a reminder. Some truths never heal. Some lies never stop echoing. But in the quiet between them, she had found something else, herself. And for now, that was enough. End. Bittersweet, unfinished, and deeply human. It was early spring, the kind of morning where the frost was barely clinging to the windowsill, unsure whether to let go. Emily sat on the porch with her coffee, watching Sophie draw chalk suns on the concrete path. The air had changed. Not just the season, but inside her. There was no more urgency to define things, no more spirals of what if or what now. just questions she no longer needed answers to. Daniel had stopped sending letters. One day, without explanation, he'd handed her the whole stack, bound in a simple manila folder. "I won't write another," he had said. "Whatever you need to know, it's in there." She hadn't opened them. Not yet. Maybe never. They sat in her closet between old art books and Sophie's baby clothes, quiet, weighty, and unresolved, like most things between them. Chapter 20. The Visitor. The knock came just after dusk. She expected Mira, or maybe even Sophie, playing a prank. But it was Claire, older than she remembered her. Weathered, dressed in a soft gray coat that made her look like she was blending into the night. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Claire said, voice hoarse. "I just needed to say something. To your face." Emily said nothing, only stepped back, enough to let her in. Curiosity overrode bitterness, if only slightly. Claire didn't sit. She stood by the window, staring out at Sophie's chalk sun, half-washed by the recent rain. "I didn't love him," she said. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse. But it was never about him." Emily's throat tightened. "Then, what was it about?" Claire smiled bitterly. "Misery. Loneliness. The kind you carry with you, even in a room full of people. I envied you. I wanted something that looked solid, even if it wasn't mine to touch." She turned then, tears in her eyes, but no weakness in her posture. "I lost a lot, more than just your husband, my job, my reputation, everything I thought made me worth anything." Silence. "I came to say I'm sorry, not to be forgiven, just so you'd know. That's all." And with that, Claire left. She walked down the path slowly, her form fading in the low mist like a ghost surrendering to the night. Chapter 21. Open letters. That night, Emily opened the folder. She read the first letter, then the third, then the one written after her. Solo show. Daniel's handwriting was messy, raw. The words were careful and clumsy, like someone learning how to feel again. One line stopped her. "I miss the version of me you made possible." She set the letter down and looked out her bedroom window. The moon was full. Sophie was asleep, clutching her stuffed fox. Somewhere across town, Daniel was probably finishing dishes or folding laundry. They were living parallel lives again. Not intersecting, but not disconnected either. Emily didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed. And for the first time in a long while, it didn't hurt. Chapter 22 new. Light a month later at Sophie's school play, they sat side by side. Daniel handed her a program, their hands brushing briefly. He looked over at her and said, "You cut your hair?" Emily nodded. "Yeah, it was time." Sophie came out as a tree, a literal tree. Arms outstretched, face painted green. They both laughed. It was unforced. Honest. Afterward, they walked too. The car together, Sophie skipping ahead. Daniel hesitated. "Emily, I know we're not who we were, but I still believe we could be something better. Even if it's just two good people raising a good girl." Emily looked at him. Not through him. Not into the past. "I don't know, Daniel. I really don't." He nodded. No arguments. No expectations, and she added quietly, "But I don't want to keep bleeding over it anymore." Final chapter, to be continued. 6 months later, Emily hosted a workshop at the community center. Art for healing. For kids, veterans, survivors of quiet wars no one ever talks about. Daniel dropped Sophie off, waving at the door. They didn't always talk. Sometimes he just left a note on Sophie's lunchbox. "Tell your mom I said hi." Sometimes Emily replied, "A cup of tea in the mailroom." A shared photo. a joke. There were no easy endings, just choices, one at a time. She didn't wear her ring anymore, but she hadn't thrown it away either. It sat in a clay bowl by the sink, beside a seashell Sophie had once called magic. Some things stayed. Some things changed. Some things were still undecided. The end. A quiet, incomplete piece. A story still unfolding. Chapter 23. The things we carry. Autumn came early that year. The leaves turned faster than usual, as if the trees were eager to shed the weight of summer. Emily noticed it during her walks, how things let go, silently, without permission. She had moved, not far, just enough. A 2-bedroom townhouse on Pine Hollow Lane, white shutters. A little garden that Sophie helped her plant with uneven rows of mums and one struggling rosemary bush. Daniel had helped move the boxes. He stayed to hang pictures, fix a leaky pipe, then left before dinner. They didn't kiss. They didn't make promises. But he lingered at the doorway a moment too long. That night, Emily lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking of the people they used to be, and the people they were still becoming. Chapter 24. Conversations in code texting had become their language. Safer, more measured. Daniel, did you remember to sign Sophie's permission slip? Emily, done. You owe me a latte. Daniel, fair. Pumpkin spice? Emily, you're predictable. Daniel, still trying to change that. Sometimes the texts were more than logistics. Emily, I saw Claire last month. Daniel, I heard. She called me. I didn't answer. Emily, why not, Daniel? Because I finally understood what I needed to say, and none of it belonged to her anymore. Emily stared at that last message a long time. It was small and enormous. Chapter 25. Echoes and Endings. It happened quietly, as these things often do. A woman named Rachel started working at the outreach center. She and Daniel became close, slowly, respectfully. She was funny, kind, and didn't flinch when Daniel told her he'd been married, twice. Emily met her one afternoon while dropping Sophie off. Rachel offered a warm smile and extended a hand. I've heard so much about you, she said gently. All of it respectful. Emily shook her hand. That's good to know. No drama, no tension, just the gentle sting of reality. Time was moving forward, with or without her permission. That night, Emily painted for the first time in weeks. Not pain, not nostalgia, just light, in long, uneven brush strokes. Chapter 26. The question, on a windy Sunday while watching Sophie at the park, Daniel turned to her. If we met now, like this, without the history, without the mess, do you think we would have chosen each other? Emily didn't answer immediately. She watched Sophie climbing the monkey bars, fearless and wild. I think, she said finally, we might have scared each other. You wanted stability. I wanted freedom. But maybe we would have been curious enough to try. Daniel smiled, more wistful than sad. Would you try again now? Emily leaned back on the bench. I think we're already trying. Just not the way we used to. Final chapter. Letting go without leaving. Thanksgiving was quiet. Daniel brought sweet potatoes. Emily cooked a small turkey. Sophie made placemats that spelled everyone's names wrong on purpose. There were jokes, wine, music playing from a Bluetooth speaker with bad reception. Rachel dropped by later with a pie. Emily offered her a plate. After dinner, Sophie fell asleep on the couch and the adults stood in the kitchen, shoulder to shoulder, but not overlapping. Daniel poured a last glass of wine and looked at Emily. You're okay, he said, not as a question, but as a truth. She nodded. I really am. And she was not whole, not broken, just healing in real time. Epilogue. Not the end. Emily stood in the garden, the rosemary finally blooming. She didn't believe in clean slates anymore. People carried too much, regret, memory, hope, but she believed in tending to the mess. Daniel still came by on Thursdays. Rachel joined them sometimes. Emily had started seeing someone too, a journalist who asked good questions and didn't try to fix her. Sophie was thriving. The world kept spinning. Somewhere between ruin and redemption, Emily had found the truest thing of all, a life not defined by betrayal, but by what came after. The end, quietly hopeful, unfinished in all the right ways. Absolutely. Let's continue, this time exploring the quieter, deeper layers of Daniel's journey. Now that Emily's found a fragile but functional peace, we'll pivot to see what he has been carrying and whether redemption is truly possible for someone who betrayed the person he once loved most. Chapter 27, Half-Lives. Daniel lived in a condo now. Sparse, tidy, a bookshelf full of secondhand novels he never finished, and a coffee maker that always sputtered like it was on its last breath. He saw Sophie 3 days a week, every other weekend. They played chess, made pancakes. She liked asking him questions he couldn't answer. Did you love Mom when you kissed Claire? Do you still think about it? Are you sorry because of what happened or because you got caught? He didn't lie. Not anymore. I loved her. I still do. And I think I betrayed both of us when I made that choice. Sophie didn't always respond, but she listened. That, he'd learned, was more important than being forgiven. Chapter 28. Letters not sent. Sometimes Daniel still wrote. But now he didn't send them to Emily. He kept a journal, not for therapy, not for clarity, just to keep his hands busy when the guilt threatened to bleed into the silence. There is no version of the story where I come out clean, only versions where I try to make fewer mistakes than the last time. I used to think love was a destination. Turns out it's just a road with no signs. I'm still walking it, alone most days, and that's okay. He once thought redemption was a moment, a conversation. Now he knew it was a pattern, something you had to live into. Chapter 29. Rachel never asked him to explain. She knew. She'd been someone's mistake once, too. Their relationship was a slow dance. No pressure, no grand declarations. They met for coffee. They made each other laugh. And when Daniel forgot to text back or hesitated to call it a date, Rachel didn't take it personally. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," she said once. "I'm just here, if you want real." He looked at her, then really looked. He hadn't known how much he missed being seen without shame. Chapter 30, Crossroads. On Sophie's birthday, Emily invited him early to help set up. The air smelled like frosting and helium. Rachel was already there, stringing up handmade banners with Emily and Mira. There was no awkwardness, no weird triangulation, just ease. When he handed Emily the extra cupcakes, their fingers brushed, and she smiled. "You seem lighter," she said. "So do you." They stood in silence for a beat too long, and then Emily looked away. "She's doing okay, isn't she?" he asked. "She's stronger than both of us," Emily said. "But yeah, she's okay." Daniel nodded. Maybe they all were, in pieces, in motion, but okay. Final chapter. Versions of forgiveness. Daniel stood outside Emily's place after the party, the sun dipping low. Sophie was inside with Mira, unpacking gifts. Emily stood next to him, arms crossed from the cold. "She asked me today if we were ever going to get back together," Daniel said. Emily didn't answer at first, just looked out across the lawn. "And what did you say?" "That I didn't know, but that whatever we were building now, it mattered." She turned to him, something soft in her expression. I'm not angry anymore, Daniel, she said. But I'm not sure I want to go back either. I wouldn't ask you to, he replied, but I'd like to keep moving forward. With you? Even if it's just side by side? Emily smiled. Faint, but real. We'll see, she said. Let's just not waste the good left between us. Epilogue. In progress a dinner. A text, a shared joke, nothing dramatic, nothing final, just two people, flawed, healing, and still trying. Daniel no longer needed to be the man he used to be. He just needed to be the one who showed up every day and meant it. The end, again, still unfinished, still hopeful, still walking forward. Sophie didn't remember the exact moment things broke. She just remembered the silence that followed. The sound of her parents arguing had become rare. Instead, there were loaded glances, quiet door closes, conversations that stopped when she entered the room. At 11, Sophie had become fluent in decoding what wasn't said. She kept a notebook under her bed, filled with lists. Things she knew. Dad didn't live with them anymore. Mom cried in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. Love could disappear, even when people said it wouldn't. And on a separate page, things she hoped. That maybe love could come back. That maybe not everything broken had to stay that way. Chapter 32. The secret investigations of Sophie Lynn Sophie had begun asking questions, not directly but cleverly, to Mira. Do adults fall out of love like kids stop liking their favorite shows? To Daniel. Did you stop living with us because you liked someone else better? To Emily. Would you ever take Dad back if he promised not to break it this time? She recorded the answers like clues. But most answers weren't answers at all. Just grown-up words wrapped in soft lies. Until one day, Mira gave her the realest response yet. Sometimes people love each other in a way that's too sharp, like glass. It looks clear and perfect until someone bleeds. Sophie stared at that sentence for weeks, drew it in bubble letters, underlined it, memorized it. Chapter 33. When Dad was just Daniel. Sophie wasn't mad at her dad. But she didn't call him Dad for a while. She called him Daniel, like the adults did, to see how it felt. He didn't correct her. One night after she beat him at chess, he leaned back and asked, "Do you hate me?" She didn't look up from the board. "I don't think I understand you enough to hate you," she said. "But I'm trying." He didn't say anything for a long time, but he stayed until she fell asleep on the couch. In the morning, she woke up tucked, under a blanket with a note next to her. "Thank you for trying. That means everything." She started calling him Dad again after that. Chapter 34. The real superpower. Sophie once thought forgiveness was something people gave each other like birthday gifts, wrapped, tied, handed over. Now she knew it was. Slower, messier, more like cleaning out a room full of things you forgot you had. Her parents still didn't live together, but they didn't fight. They laughed sometimes. There were movie nights with all three of them. Rachel brought cookies. Mom made tea. Nobody looked uncomfortable anymore. It wasn't what Sophie had hoped for exactly, but it wasn't bad. And she'd learned something powerful in the wreckage. Sometimes, surviving is the closest thing to magic. Final chapter. Not all homes have walls. Sophie stood in her mom's garden, clipping a few sprigs of rosemary for a school project. Daniel was inside, fixing the sink. Rachel had stayed for dinner. Her mom hummed while folding laundry. It didn't look like the family she used to draw in crayon, but it was real. A house with open doors, a circle of people still figuring it out. A new version of love that didn't erase the past, but didn't live inside it either. She looked at her parents through the window, catching them both laughing at something small, and she smiled. Because even broken things can hold light. The End, Sophie's chapter. A child's eye view of pain, patience, and the quiet resilience of choosing love anyway. The Woman Who Came. After people called her the woman who came after, Rachel had learned to live in parentheses. She was the postscript, the cautionary footnote. And while she hadn't asked to be part of anyone's redemption arc, somehow that's where she'd landed. With Daniel, with his past, with his grief. She hadn't chased him. She'd simply been there, long enough for the dust to settle, long enough to see what remained. She loved him in the way a gardener loves neglected soil, carefully, patiently, without expecting it to bloom on cue, and still, sometimes, she wondered if she was growing something, or waiting for something already dead to come back to life. Chapter 36. Different Kind of Ghost. Rachel knew about Claire, not from Daniel, not entirely. They'd crossed paths once at a benefit dinner. Rachel saw the way Claire watched Daniel, like a man who'd been hers and still owed her something. Pity, perhaps, or guilt. Claire had the presence of someone who believed she was the only real chapter in his life. Everyone else was just an interlude. Rachel didn't feel threatened, just studied. Later that night, Rachel asked Daniel plainly, "If she asked for you back, would you go?" Daniel didn't flinch. "No, but I'd still want to know why," she asked. Rachel nodded. That answer was real. Painfully, beautifully real. Chapter 37. When you love someone. Flawed-loving Daniel meant choosing someone in progress. It meant living with the ghosts he couldn't always name, the memories that sometimes choked him mid-sentence. It meant learning the difference between his silence and withdrawal, between his effort and avoidance. He wasn't easy, but he was honest. Brutally so. Rachel had once been married, too, to a man who smiled in public and weaponized silence in private, so Daniel's emotional roughness didn't scare her. What terrified her was that he tried. He tried every day, and maybe, just maybe, that was a deeper kind of love. Chapter 38, Dinner with Emily. Rachel had expected it to be awkward. Emily had invited her, formally, kindly, with grace that made Rachel uncomfortable. You're part of Sophie's life, and that matters. They drank wine, talked about the school fundraiser, the casserole, weather, and then came the silence, the pause where truth could slip in. Rachel broke it first. Do you ever wonder if it should have been someone else? Not me? Emily smiled, not bitter, just tired. No, because I don't think this version of Daniel existed until after. Rachel held that, like a warm stone in her palm. They were not enemies, just survivors of different versions of the same man. Chapter 39. The choice to stay one night, Rachel found Daniel asleep on the couch, the journal in his lap, open to a page he hadn't meant to leave exposed. I don't know how to love her without comparing her to who I used to be. But I want to try. I want to become the man she sees, even if I'm not sure he exists yet. Rachel closed the journal, gently. She didn't wake him, just laid a blanket over him, sat beside him, and whispered, not for him, but for herself. I see you. That's enough. She didn't need a perfect man. She just needed one who stayed. Final chapter, The Woman Who. Stayed. After Rachel wasn't the woman who came after. She was the one who stayed after guilt, after silence, after doubt. After a family rebuilt itself from a ruin no one asked for. And though she would never wear the crown of Daniel's first love, she held something more precious. The man who had chosen to become worthy. One day at a time. With her. With Sophie. With himself. Rachel didn't believe in perfect endings, but she believed in showing up, and for the first time in her life, someone showed up too. The end, Rachel's chapter. A quiet redemption. A love built not from fantasy, but from what remains after everything burns down. Claire always told herself she left before she was left. She said it like a mantra. Because in her world, leaving meant control, power. It was cleaner to betray than to be forgotten. Even now, years later, she couldn't say Daniel's name without tasting the bitterness she had never swallowed properly. He had loved her, once, wildly. But she had loved the version of him that made her feel invincible. Not the real man, the one who cried when his father died. The one who stopped needing her approval. She didn't cheat because she stopped loving him. She cheated because she didn't know how to be loved without conditions. Chapter 41. The echoes of a lie after the divorce, Claire moved across the city, switched jobs, started yoga, dated men who weren't like Daniel, or worse, men who tried to be. She became that woman at work, polished, efficient, lonely in a way nobody could quite name. People said she was cold. She preferred that to fragile. One night, after too much, "Wine," she messaged Daniel. "Do you hate me?" He replied hours later. "No, I just stopped believing in the version of me you needed." She didn't respond. But she kept the message, read it sometimes like scripture. Chapter 42. The moment she broke, but no one saw it. It was at Sophie's school play. Claire sat 3 rows behind Rachel. Emily was next to Daniel, a family Claire had once designed. Like architecture now stood solid without her. And yet, no one looked angry. No one avoided her gaze. Sophie smiled when she saw her, hugged her after the performance. "Thanks for coming," she said. Like forgiveness could be given without ceremony. That was the moment Claire cracked. Not because she was excluded, but because they had built something without her, and it was still beautiful. Chapter 43. The woman in the mirror, Claire, went home that night and looked at herself. Not with cruelty, with honesty. She took off the armor. Let herself remember what she had done, not just to Daniel, but to herself. She'd sabotaged love because she believed she didn't deserve it. And that belief had become prophecy. But what if redemption wasn't being invited back into someone's life? What if it was learning to stay in your own skin without flinching? Chapter 44. When no one's looking, Claire started therapy. Quietly, unapologetically, she began writing again. Not for work, for herself. Letters she never sent, truths she never voiced out loud. She reached out to Emily once. An email. "I know I caused damage. I can't undo it. But I'm sorry, truly, and I hope your peace is louder than the storm I left behind." Emily never replied, but Claire didn't need her to. Some apologies weren't for the recipient. They were for the woman in the mirror who was finally tired of running. Final chapter. The T. Woman who didn't return, but remained. Claire didn't ask to be forgiven. She didn't try to rebuild what she broke, but she planted something new, a life with no mirrors, no masks, no curated stories. She began teaching creative writing part-time, started a book club, learned to sit in silence without needing it to validate her worth. She ran into Daniel once at the farmer's market. They talked about Sophie, about the weather. Then he said softly, "You look lighter." Claire smiled. "I am." No reunion. No apology tour. Just 2 people who had finally outlived the wreckage they made, and that was enough. The sun was gentle that morning. Spring held the air like a promise. Daniel stood at the edge of the high school parking lot, watching Sophie help set up for the senior art showcase. She was 17 now. More Rachel's mannerisms than his. More Emily's quiet drive than Claire's spark. But still her own. Completely. She caught his eye and waved. He smiled and waved back, his heart doing that strange thing it did now when he looked at her. Ache and gratitude, perfectly fused. Daniel. Never remarried, not legally, but Rachel was his partner in every way that mattered. They'd built something low to the ground and solid. Morning coffees, Saturday hikes, therapy appointments they sometimes attended together and sometimes alone. There was no rush to make it official. What mattered was that they kept choosing each other. Not out of obligation, out of alignment. Sometimes, late at night, he would reread old journal entries. His handwriting from those darker years looked foreign now. Tight, furious, like someone carving his voice out of concrete. He no longer needed to write to survive. He just lived. Rachel had opened a small bookshop and cafe 2 years ago. Second Editions, it was called. A place for people starting over. She didn't tell Daniel this, but she kept a worn photo of Sophie as a child taped behind the register. Not because she missed the past, but because it reminded her that families aren't always built by blood or vows. Sometimes they're built by presence, by choice. She had chosen to love a man in pieces, and he had chosen to become whole. Not perfectly. But honestly, Emily moved to Boston with her new partner Mara and taught part-time at a community college. Her relationship with Daniel was steady, respectful. They co-parented across cities with grace. She had forgiven Claire, silently in her own way, not because Claire asked, but because Emily knew holding on to bitterness was like keeping her hands clenched when she needed them open for better things. She once wrote in a journal, "The greatest love I've ever given was to myself, finally." And she meant it. Claire still lived in the city. She ran writing workshops for women starting over after divorce, grief, betrayal. She never talked about her own past directly, but it lived in the way she encouraged others, in the silences she held space for. She dated here and there, never seriously, but she smiled more. One night, alone on her balcony with a glass of wine, she opened an old envelope she'd never sent. It was a letter to Sophie. "I failed you in ways I still don't fully understand, but I hope you've built a world where love is not something to survive, but something that shelters you." She folded it back, placed it in the drawer. Some things don't need to be sent to be real. Sophie, at 17, Sophie had a sharp mind and a gentler soul. She understood more than anyone thought. She once told Daniel, "You all made mistakes, but none of you ran forever. That's what matters." She was applying to art school, wanted to study visual storytelling, said she was fascinated by the way people rebuild. Daniel asked her why. She shrugged. Because it's easy to destroy things, but to make something, again, even after the worst, that's real magic. Final lines, none of them had perfect endings. But all of them chose at some point to stop bleeding and start healing. That, in the end, was their legacy. Not the betrayal, but the quiet, messy, brave decision to keep living after it. The end. A story of love broken, reformed, and rewritten, not as a fairy tale but as something far rarer, real. The years had unfolded differently for each of them. But life, complicated, relentless life, had a way of bringing them together again, even when they thought they were separate, isolated, or free from the shadows of their pasts. Claire's chapter, A Quiet Victory. Claire sat in the corner of her bookshop cafe, flipping through a well-worn journal. The sun was just beginning to set, spilling golden light over the shelves filled with books, magazines, journals. It had become a sanctuary, her sanctuary. And it had a rhythm now, a steadiness she once thought was impossible. The phone rang. She answered, almost absent-mindedly. "Hey, it's Emily," came the voice on the other end. "You okay?" Claire smiled softly. Emily, A soft-voiced woman who had once shared her anger and frustration now shared something far more precious. Understanding. Emily's words were never filled with expectation, just presence, and it had been enough. "Yeah, I'm okay, just thinking." There was a pause before Emily asked, "Do you ever think about what might have been, if you'd done things differently?" Claire hesitated. It wasn't the first time she had asked herself that question. If she had stayed, if she hadn't run, if she had told Daniel the truth, sooner. But maybe the question wasn't about what she could have done differently. Maybe the question was about who she was now. "I think about it," she said softly, "but I don't regret leaving. I think, if I hadn't, I'd still be running, and I need to stop doing that." "I get that," Emily replied, her voice gentle. Claire leaned back, exhaling slowly. There was something freeing in the acceptance of that. She had spent so many years running away, fleeing from herself and the pain. But now, she had stopped running. Daniel's chapter. The ties. That bind Daniel sat at his kitchen table, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, staring out the window. It had been 5 years since the day he had stood in the yard with Sophie watching her graduate. Now she was halfway through her first year at art school, her dreams unfolding in ways he hadn't anticipated, but in ways that were uniquely hers. He could feel Rachel's presence in the kitchen behind him, her footsteps light on the hardwood floor. She handed him the plate of eggs she had made, a familiar comfort between them. They'd built a life, their life, and yet he could never quite shake the weight of those earlier years, of everything they had survived. "You ever think about her?" Rachel asked, her voice soft but laden with a question he hadn't been asked in a while. "Claire?" Daniel muttered, looking at his cup before meeting Rachel's eyes. There was no bitterness in her gaze, only curiosity, a curiosity born of time, of healing. "Sometimes, but I don't think about the past the way I used to." Rachel nodded, setting her own plate down. "Good. I just want to make sure we're still here. Still us." "We are," he said, meeting her gaze with a steady conviction he hadn't always had. "We're still here." Sophie's chapter. The art of letting go. Sophie had always been a little quieter than most kids. She had an artist's soul, the kind that found beauty in the cracks, in the imperfections. At the art school dorms, her new friends called her the old soul because of her calm presence, her habit of listening more than speaking. She still talked to Daniel almost every week, and she texted Emily occasionally. But the relationship she kept closest to her heart was with herself. She had learned in the past few years how to be her own anchor, to stop seeking approval from others, especially from those who couldn't see her for who she truly was. One night after a gallery opening, Sophie found herself on the phone with Claire, her mother, for the first time in months. There was no expectation in the conversation, only a quiet, mutual understanding. "You still paint?" Claire asked, her voice tentative but sincere. Sophie smiled, the connection warm. "I do. I think about it differently now. Not to be someone's something, but just because I need to. Because it's what I need." Claire nodded, though Sophie couldn't see her. "I'm proud of you. I want you to know that. I always will be." Sophie paused, the words weighing heavily in her chest. She had never asked for her mother's approval, but hearing it, in this moment, felt like a quiet weight lifting. "Thanks, Mom," she whispered, before adding softly, "I think I understand you a little more now." Emily's chapter. The unspoken bond. Emily sat by the window of her apartment, the light of the city flickering in the distance. She had long ago stopped wondering whether Claire would ever reach out again. There had been no need. But sometimes, late at night, Emily would think about the woman who had once been everything to her, who had broken her heart in ways she would never fully comprehend. But then, just as she would think about the distance between them, something else would come to her. Claire had also shown her what it meant to rebuild, to survive, and even to forgive. Emily's life had moved on, too. She had married Mara last year in a small ceremony by the lake. It was quiet, simple, but it was everything Emily had dreamed of. A life grounded in truth, love, and authenticity. And, in a way, that's what Claire had given her. A path toward accepting herself, finding peace with the past, and learning that some scars, while still visible, no longer carried the weight they once did. The unseen ties. None of them knew where the road ahead would lead. There were no promises, no guarantees. But what they did know was this: they were free. Free not from the past, but free because of it, because they had chosen to stop running, because they had chosen to heal. And now they could finally start walking in their own shoes. The end. Final epilogue. A quiet beginning. The last page turned, the ink still fresh but no longer blurry with regret. It had been nearly 2 years since Claire had left her tumultuous past behind. She'd built her bookshop cafe into something more than just a business. It was a refuge. The walls were lined with books she had always wanted to read, books about redemption, loss, and love in all its forms. They were her way of confronting the ghosts of her mistakes, trying to understand where she had gone wrong and where she had gone right. Some nights, after closing, Claire would sit in the dim light with her notebook, writing letters she never sent. Letters to her old self, to Sophie, to Daniel, even to Rachel. She didn't expect answers, but writing allowed her to see things clearly. It allowed her to forgive herself in fragments. "Tonight," she wrote to Sophie, "I hope one day you'll understand why I couldn't stay. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was too broken to be the mother you deserved. I hope you find it in you to forgive me. Not for me, but for you. Because I want you to live free. I want you to live without carrying me around inside you." She folded the letter and tucked it inside her desk drawer. There was no urgency to send it anymore. There was only the need to release the words. She didn't need Sophie's forgiveness, not to move on. But there was a longing there, like a forgotten song she would always hum softly to herself. Daniel's chapter. The long conversation. Daniel sat across from Rachel at their kitchen table, the one they had bought together when they first moved. Into their home, before everything unraveled, before the weight of the world had felt like it was crushing them both. It had been a quiet, ordinary evening. Sophie had gone to the studio for a project, Emily was out of town with Mara, and Rachel had made pasta, their favorite comfort food. The scent of garlic and basil filled the air as Daniel put down his fork and looked at his wife. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, her face soft with the satisfaction of a meal well prepared. "Do you ever wonder," Rachel began, "if we'd be different now? If we had made different choices? If we could just go back?" Daniel
leaned back in his chair, eyes focused on the window. He didn't need to answer immediately. He had been asked the question more than once before. Indifferent. First time Rachel had asked it with such...
"Was no going back," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "But I don't think we needed to. I think we needed to keep going forward," Rachel nodded, chewing on her lower lip as though the weight of that thought sat with her too. "I think I'm finally starting to see that," she said softly. "I spent so much time afraid of losing everything. But maybe that was never really the issue. The issue was whether we could choose to build something, together, after everything had fallen apart." Daniel met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the absence of tension, the absence of unresolved anger. Just peace. It wasn't perfect. There were still things unsaid, cracks that would never fully disappear. But they were different now. They had changed because they had both stopped pretending. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Sophie's chapter. The space between. Sophie had become something of an enigma to her classmates. She was the artist, the one who sketched quietly in the corner, who captured the world in strokes of charcoal and vibrant paint. People admired her work but didn't always understand her. She was a reflection of everything she had lived through, but also something more. A mosaic made of experiences, moments of clarity, and swaths of color she had yet to fully grasp. One day, Sophie came across an old email from her mother. It had been sent months ago, shortly after Claire had reached out through a distant letter. The message was simple, just a few lines, but Sophie hadn't been able to read it until now. I don't expect you to understand me. I don't even expect forgiveness. But I hope you know someday I did love you. I still do. That love isn't gone just because I am. It will never go away. The words stirred something in Sophie, a mixture of grief and acceptance. She didn't feel the weight of the past so much anymore. She had her own future now, and that future was still being painted, still in progress. But Claire's absence, while it had hurt her, no longer defined her. She picked up her brush and began to paint. Emily's chapter. The other side of things, Emily had moved into a new phase of her life. She and Mara had married in a small, quiet ceremony, and now they were expecting their first child. Emily was as conflicted as anyone would be when stepping into the unknown. She had never pictured herself as a mother. Her past had been filled with enough heartbreak to make her question everything, even her ability to love and care for another. But when she looked at Mara, when she thought about their child, the future didn't seem so intimidating. It felt like the first real chance at something pure, and somewhere in the deep recesses of her mind, she thought of Claire. She thought about how much she had loved her, how she had wanted her mother to be the person she had needed. But now, Emily knew she was her own person. She had made her own choices. She was carving out her own legacy, and in that, there was peace. The final threads, tying together the years would pass. They always did. Life was an intricate weave, full of knots and twists, but it was always moving forward. The characters, like us, would continue to change, sometimes slowly, sometimes in fits and starts. But the important thing in the end was that they all made the choice to rebuild, not perfectly, but with intent, with care. They had all been broken in ways they couldn't fix right away, but they chose to begin the healing process anyway. And maybe that, after all, was the true measure of love. Whether you could still choose to love when the world seemed to be pulling you apart. The End. Final Reflections. A story of survival, not in the absence of scars, but in learning to live alongside them, building something new from the pieces.